A goalkeeper in Brazil couldn't walk into a supermarket without being recognized. A woman stopped him on the street once, pulled her son close, pointed at him, and quietly said, "That man gave our people the greatest sadness." He died close to poverty, 50 years after the match, still carrying a single moment, one afternoon, one save he didn't make. And you might hear that and think that's too much weight to put on a sport. But that's exactly what the World Cup does. It doesn't just produce results, it creates memories that entire countries carry for generations.
And right now, in 2026, the biggest event in human history is happening here on American soil. And most people watching don't fully understand what they're actually looking at. I'm going to show you how this thing got built. Because it wasn't built on love, wasn't built on passion. It was built on a fight, a business deal, and a trophy carried across the Atlantic in a shoebox.
Let's go back to the beginning, early 20th century. If you wanted to watch the best soccer players on earth compete for something real, you watched the Olympics. That was the deal. That was the stage. The Olympics were the pinnacle of international sport, and football was part of it. But there was a rule that changed everything. Only amateurs could play. No professionals, no one who earned a living from the game. Which sounds noble on paper, clean even. The idea that sport should exist outside of money, beyond commerce. The problem is that the best players in the world, the men who fed their families through football, were explicitly banned from competing.
The Olympics didn't want them. Too commercial, too professional, too real. And there was one man who looked at that and thought, this is absurd. His name was Jules Rimet. Rimet became FIFA president in 1921, and from day one, he had one central idea. The best players in the world should be able to represent their countries, professionals included, no exceptions. He spent the better part of a decade pushing for a separate world championship, one that didn't ask players to pretend they weren't professionals, one that didn't operate in some fantasy where money didn't exist in sport.
The football establishment didn't want it. England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, the countries that invented the game, wanted nothing to do with it. They refused to even join FIFA. But Rimet kept pushing. And in May 1928, at the 17th FIFA Congress in Amsterdam, the vote passed. There would be a World Cup, a separate tournament, open to professionals, controlled by FIFA, held every 4 years. That moment deserves more credit than it gets. What FIFA decided in 1928 wasn't just a tournament format, it was a philosophy, a statement that the best players in the world deserved a stage that matched who they actually were. Then came the first compromise, and it told you everything about what this tournament would eventually become. Uruguay, the reigning Olympic champions, offered to pay every nation's travel expenses if they could host the first edition. FIFA agreed.
Let that sit for a second. The World Cup was born as a commercial negotiation before a single ball was ever kicked, before a single whistle was blown, before a single ticket was sold. The first major decision in World Cup history was who's paying and what do they get in return. Uruguay 1930, 13 teams, 4 European nations who made a 2-week ship crossing to get there. The tournament lasted 18 days. Uruguay won on home soil. No corporate sponsors, no television deal, no satellite broadcast. The trophy, the Jules Rimet Trophy, a small gold statuette of Nike, goddess of victory, was carried across the Atlantic in a shoebox by Rimet himself on a steamship called the Conte Verde.
A shoebox! And yet something happened in those 18 days that no Olympic competition had ever produced. Something quiet, something that wouldn't fully reveal itself for another 20 years. The World Cup, even in its rawest form, made people feel that something real was at stake. Something beyond a trophy, something personal, cultural, specific to who they were as a people. There was no marketing department in 1930, no PR strategy, no brand consultants. You couldn't manufacture that feeling. It just happened. The power of this tournament existed before any of that. It was there before the money arrived, which means the money didn't create the power. It just found it. And once it found it, it never let go. Rio de Janeiro, 1950. Brazil hadn't just prepared for this World Cup. They had built toward it, the way countries build toward declarations. the way nations construct monuments to what they believe they are about to become.
They built the Maracana, the largest stadium ever constructed, purpose-built to hold 200,000 people, concrete and steel rising out of the ground as a physical statement that Brazil had arrived as a modern nation, as a global power. And the team they put on that field felt like destiny made flesh. Brazil's squad in 1950 was considered not just the best in the tournament, but possibly the best ever assembled. The country wasn't preparing to compete. They were preparing to be crowned. On the morning of the final, the Rio newspaper O Mundo printed its front page with a photograph of the Brazilian squad and a single headline: World Champions. They hadn't played the game yet. In front of 200,000 people, the largest crowd in World Cup history, Brazil lost 2-1 to Uruguay. And what happened next is one of the most extraordinary things in the history of sport. The country didn't recover. Not quickly, not cleanly. Brazil entered a period of collective mourning that lasted years. The writer Nelson Rodrigues called it their Hiroshima, a national wound so deep it didn't have a name for it yet. The goalkeeper, Moacir Barbosa, was made to carry it alone for the rest of his life. Decades after the match, a woman stopped him on the street and pointed him out to her son. That man, she said, gave our people the greatest sadness. He died close to poverty in the year 2000, still carrying 1950. He once said the maximum sentence in Brazil is 30 years in prison, but he had been paying for something he wasn't even responsible for 50 years. Think about that. One afternoon, one tournament, one result, and a man's entire life was shaped by it. Not his career, his life. That's not a sports story anymore. That's something else entirely. And FIFA, the organization running this tournament, had 11 people in a Zurich office and was essentially broke. A volunteer organization running on goodwill, presiding over an event that was quietly becoming one of the most emotionally powerful things on earth. Then the televisions arrived. 1954, World Cup in Switzerland. For the first time, matches were broadcast live on television in Europe. Only a handful of games actually televised, but for the first time, the tournament existed beyond the stadium. You didn't have to be there to witness it. The game could come to you. That was new. That was everything. 12 years later, in 1966, communication satellites changed the scale completely. For the first time, the World Cup was broadcast worldwide simultaneously. 400 million people watched the final globally. In England alone, 32.3 million tuned in, more than half the population. To this day, it remains the most watched television event in British history. And right there, in that gap between what the World Cup was worth and what FIFA was actually collecting from it, the future of the tournament started taking shape. Because what television did wasn't just widen the audience, it revealed what the World Cup actually was. A mass media event. A shared moment of global attention concentrated every 4 years, directed at a single stage. The entire world watched, together, simultaneously, in a way that had never existed before for anything. The power that made a Brazilian goalkeeper carry a nation's grief for 50 years, that power was now being transmitted into living rooms across 6 continents. And FIFA was still operating out of a small office in Zurich. Something had to change. By the early 1970s, the World Cup had a problem. Actually, it had 3. It was running out of money. It was excluding entire continents, and the organization running it was too small and too broke to fix any of those things. Then João Havelange walked into the room. Havelange ran for FIFA president in 1974 on an explicit platform. More teams, more nations, more access for the developing world. He campaigned across Africa and Asia in countries that had never been taken seriously by European football power. He made promises, and he won. Then he said something out loud that no FIFA president had ever said before. I came here to sell a product called football, and my intention is for this product to reach as many consumers as it can, and for its price to constantly grow.
No apology,
No pretense. No language about the purity of sport. Just business. Stated plainly. And what Havelange understood, what his predecessors had never fully reckoned with, was what FIFA actually owned. Every 4 years, billions of human beings directed their attention to a single tournament, simultaneously, across every continent, every language, every culture. That concentration of global attention was one of the most valuable things on Earth. And FIFA had been giving it away. Havelange partnered with Horst Dassler of Adidas, signed landmark deals with Coca-Cola, built a commercial infrastructure from scratch, and then he used that money to do exactly what he'd promised when he ran for office. The tournament expanded from 16 teams to 24. Africa got real representation for the first time. Latin American nations outside the traditional powers had a genuine path to the World Cup stage. Countries that had watched from the outside now had a seat at the table. The commercial machine funded the democratic promise. That's the part that gets lost when people talk about FIFA's commercialization. The money and the expansion weren't separate stories. They were the same story. Havelange needed the sponsors to pay for the promises he'd made to get elected. And those promises, more teams, more nations, more voices, were the closest the World Cup had ever come to what Jules Rimet actually said it was for. And then came 1994. The United States hosted the World Cup, and the argument for giving America the tournament wasn't romantic. The US was one of the world's biggest economies. The stadiums were already built. FIFA did it because the math worked. What actually happened was something nobody fully predicted. 3.6 million people attended, still the most attended World Cup in history. The US team advanced out of the group stage for the first time since 1930, and 2 years later, MLS was born. But the thing that struck people who were there, the thing Roger Bennett describes about arriving in America for that tournament, was something harder to quantify. It was the feeling of a country reconnecting to something it hadn't known it had lost.
Immigrants in the stands, communities that had carried these teams across oceans quietly for generations, suddenly visible, suddenly loud, suddenly part of the story. When Korea played, Korean Americans showed up. When Ireland played, New Jersey turned into something between Angela's Ashes and a Sopranos episode. When Ghana played, when Curaçao played, people found something in those stadiums. They found a version of themselves. And that's what the commercial expansion of the World Cup produced at its best. Not just revenue, not just bigger audiences, a moment every 4 years where the country you came from, the culture you carried, the language you spoke at home, it mattered. It was seen. The problem, and there's always a problem when this much money is involved, was that the machine didn't stop there.
Here's something worth sitting with. The same power that makes the World Cup capable of changing the way entire countries see themselves, that exact same power can be pointed in any direction by whoever controls the stage. And in 1978, somebody pointed it somewhere very dark. Argentina hosted the World Cup that year. By the time the tournament kicked off in June 1978, the country was 2 years into a military dictatorship. General Jorge Rafael Videla was in power. The dirty war was in full force. Between 15,000 and 30,000 people had been disappeared, kidnapped, tortured, killed by a regime that had seized power in a coup and was systematically eliminating anyone it considered a threat. Detention centers operated within miles of the stadiums. Prisoners reportedly heard crowd noise during matches, and the junta understood exactly what the World Cup could do for them. This wasn't accidental. They poured resources into the tournament, managed the international press, controlled the narrative with precision. Used 4 weeks of global attention as a legitimacy machine, a smokescreen for state-sponsored terror broadcast to hundreds of millions of people around the world. Argentina won the final against the Netherlands. The streets erupted. Videla lifted the trophy, and the world largely moved on.
The same power that put Zidane's face on the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, that exact same power handed a military dictator a moment of international credibility that his regime could not have bought any other way. Because that's the nature of a mirror that large. It doesn't choose what it reflects. It just reflects whoever's standing in front of it. During the 1982 World Cup in Spain, Havelange and Horst Dassler created a marketing agency to control all of FIFA's commercial activities, the International Sport and Leisure Agency, ISL. The concept was clean on paper. Bundle FIFA sponsorship rights together, sell them to multinational corporations as exclusive packages. Combine that with broadcast rights in a rapidly expanding global television market, it was a gold mine. FIFA went from 11 employees and no money to one of the most financially powerful sports institutions on earth, and ISL was the engine.
The same power that put Zidane's face on the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, that exact FWA team that offered World Cup Live champions. What came out later was that ISL had been systematically bribing FIFA officials for years in exchange for broadcasting rights and sponsorship contracts. The man who inherited and expanded that system was Sepp Blatter. Under his watch, FIFA went from a powerful commercial organization to something federal prosecutors would describe in much more direct language. Then there was Chuck Blazer, American, Executive Secretary of CONCACAF, the governing body for North and Central American football, one of the most powerful men in world football for 2 decades. He lived in Trump Tower in New York, rented a second apartment in the same building just for his cats, attended FIFA congresses on a mobility scooter, and by his own later admission, took bribes for nearly his entire tenure.
In 2011, facing his own federal investigation, Blazer became an FBI informant. For the next several years, he walked around FIFA events with a recording device hidden in his lapel pin, transmitting conversations to federal investigators. At the same congresses, the same dinners, the same rooms where the decisions about the world's biggest sporting event were being made. In May 2015, Swiss authorities conducted dawn raids on a Zurich hotel, arrested senior FIFA officials at the request of the FBI. Wire fraud, racketeering, money laundering. Decades of systemic corruption reaching a legal reckoning all at once. Sepp Blatter resigned 4 days after the arrests. He had simultaneously been campaigning for a 6th term as president. And here's the part that matters most. This isn't the story of one man who went corrupt, one bad actor in an otherwise clean system. This is the story of an institution that had grown so powerful, it stopped listening to its critics, stopped listening to the game.
The machine had gotten bigger than the thing it was supposed to serve, and it was about to make a decision that would show exactly how far it had traveled from what Jules Rimet had argued for in 1928. In 2010, FIFA awarded the 2022 World Cup to Qatar, a country with no football culture to speak of, summers that regularly reach 50 degrees Celsius, 120 Fahrenheit, temperatures at which playing professional soccer outdoors isn't just uncomfortable, it's genuinely dangerous. No stadiums, no infrastructure, no history with the tournament, no obvious reason from a sporting perspective to give it the biggest event in human history. What Qatar had was money and the will to spend it. The FBI investigation that followed implicated the 2022 bid process in systemic bribery. Multiple FIFA voters were found to have received payments. The process that awarded the World Cup to Qatar was, in the considered judgment of American federal prosecutors, corrupt.
Qatar needed stadiums. 8 of them. Air-conditioned. Built from scratch in the desert. The workforce that built them came primarily from South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Workers from Nepal, India, Bangladesh, the Philippines. Men who left home for a wage and ended up in conditions that human rights organizations described with a very specific phrase: modern slavery. The Guardian estimated the death toll across the construction period at over 6,500 workers. 6,500 people. And the World Cup still happened. Billions watched. The matches were played. The trophy was lifted. And the conversation about those 6,500 lives, it came and went, folded back into the noise.
Because the original argument, the one that gave Africa real representation, that opened the door for nations that had spent decades on the outside, was about giving more people a voice, about bringing more of the world into the room. And that same logic, carried to its furthest point,
produced a process that handed the tournament to a petrostate, that put the lives of thousands of working-class men in jeopardy, that consumed the very people the machine was supposed to elevate. The mirror the World Cup holds up doesn't just show the beautiful parts. Then, in 2017, FIFA President Gianni Infantino announced the next expansion. 2026 would become a 48-team tournament, 104 matches instead of 64. More broadcast rights, more advertising inventory, more of everything that generates revenue. Because the expansion to 48 teams means nations that have never stood on this stage before will stand on it in 2026. Countries whose players grew up watching this tournament as something that belonged to someone else. That's real. That matters. But the tournament is also projected to be the most commercially successful in human history. More money than most countries produce in a year. And it's happening here, in America, at one of the most turbulent moments in this country's modern history. A country in an active argument with itself about who belongs, about who gets to come, about what the people who built soccer in this country, who fill these stadiums, about what they should have to fear when they gather in public. The World Cup has always arrived at complicated moments. 1950, a nation building its identity. 1978, a regime hiding its crimes. 1994, a country discovering a part of itself it had forgotten. 2022, a global reckoning with what the machine had become. And now, 2026. The same tournament, the same stage, the same power that made a goalkeeper carry a nation's grief for 50 years, landing in a country that hasn't figured out yet what it wants to show the world.
Roger Bennett said something that stayed with me. He called the World Cup the last global megaphone that's audible across the entire planet. Nothing else like it exists. Not the Super Bowl, not the Olympics, not any political summit or viral event. Nothing concentrates human attention across every language, every continent, every culture, the way this tournament does every 4 years. And whoever holds that megaphone holds something extraordinary. The question, the one that doesn't have a clean answer, is whether what arrives with it in 2026 is still worth what it costs to build. Here's the thing nobody talks about enough. The World Cup doesn't ask for your permission. It doesn't wait for you to make peace with its contradictions. It doesn't pause while you figure out how you feel about FIFA or Qatar or the ticket prices at MetLife Stadium. It just arrives. And you watch. And something happens to you that you didn't fully plan for.
That tension between knowing exactly what this machine costs and still feeling something real when the ball hits the back of the net, that's what this whole video has been building toward. Because that tension isn't a flaw. It might be the most honest way to experience it. If you've made it this far, you already know you care about this stuff more than the average fan. And that's exactly who this channel is for. We cover the World Cup every single day. The stories behind the stories. The history underneath the history. Subscribe and follow us. You won't regret it. And I want to ask you something directly. Do you think it's possible to love the World Cup and still hold FIFA accountable? Drop that in the comments. I'm genuinely curious where you land on that. Because here's what I keep coming back to. Roger Bennett, a man who has spent his entire adult life living inside this sport, said he wonders constantly if he's a hypocrite for loving this tournament, for watching it, knowing full well what built it. And I think most people who follow this sport feel some version of that, quietly, without fully naming it.
The 1930 World Cup was carried across the Atlantic in a shoebox. No sponsors, no television deal, no commercial infrastructure of any kind. And it still produced something so powerful that a goalkeeper spent 50 years carrying the weight of a single afternoon. That power existed before the money. That's what makes this so hard to resolve cleanly. Because the machine, as corrupt as it got, as far as it traveled from what it was supposed to be, it also built something real. It gave nations a stage. It gave communities a mirror. It gave people a shared text that transcends language and borders and political systems in a way that almost nothing else on Earth does. The 1998 French team won the World Cup in Paris, and France projected Zidane's face on the Arc de Triomphe, a kid of Algerian immigrants, on the most iconic monument in the country, because of soccer. That happened. And it happened through the same commercial machine that would later oversee corruption scandals and construction sites where men died in the desert. both things are true simultaneously, and there's no version of this story where you get one without the other.
And somewhere in all of that, in a group stage match in Kansas City, or a last-minute goal in Los Angeles, or a goalkeeper from a country you've never heard of making a save that his grandchildren will talk about, something will happen that no marketing department planned for. Something that can't be manufactured. The same something that happened in Uruguay in 1930, before anyone knew what any of this would become. There's a detail from 1930 that I keep returning to. Jules Rimet, the man who spent a decade fighting for this tournament to exist, who pushed when England refused, when the football establishment laughed, when nobody believed the World Cup would amount to anything. He crossed the Atlantic on a steamship with the trophy in a shoebox. Not a case, not a vault, not some ceremonial container with a lock and a seal. A shoebox, tucked under his arm on a boat called the Conte Verde, sailing toward Uruguay for a tournament that 13 nations had agreed to attend, that 4 European teams had made a 2-week journey to reach, that had no television deal and no corporate sponsors and no commercial infrastructure of any kind. A shoebox.
And out of that specific modesty, that specific absence of spectacle, came something that would change the way countries understood themselves, that would put a man's face on a national monument, that would make a goalkeeper carry a nation's grief for half a century. That would be used by a military dictatorship as a global legitimacy machine. That would generate more revenue than most countries produce in a year. That would bring 48 nations to American soil in 2026 for the most watched event in human history. All of that from a shoebox. The World Cup didn't start with a vision of empire. It started with a fight about who deserved to play. A fight about whether the best in the world should be allowed to compete or excluded because they had the audacity to earn a living from their gift. That fight never really ended. It just changed shape. In 1928, the question was amateurs versus professionals. In 1974, it was about who got a seat at the table. In 2015, it was about who was writing the checks underneath that table.
In 2022, it was about whose lives the table was built on. And in 2026, it's about what America chooses to see when the world shows up at its door. The World Cup has always been a mirror. That's not a metaphor, that's its actual function. It reflects whoever's standing in front of it, the beauty and the corruption, the communion and the exploitation. The goalkeeper who became a legend and the one who died carrying 1950. The nation that found itself in a final and the regime that used one to hide its crimes. It holds all of it simultaneously, without apology. And billions of people watch anyway, not because they're naive, but because the alternative, not feeling it, not being in that shared moment, not letting something matter, that feels worse somehow, even knowing what you know. Roger Bennett said he's not at peace with it, not resolved. I think that's the right place to be. Because the people who are fully at peace with the World Cup have either stopped looking at what it costs or stopped feeling what it gives.
The shoebox crossed the Atlantic in 1930. It arrived in Montevideo, and something was set in motion that has never stopped. In 2026, it comes here. And whatever you feel when you watch, the joy, the doubt, the discomfort, the inexplicable thing that happens in your chest when a country you've never been to scores a goal that meant everything to them, that feeling is real. It was real before the money found it, and it'll be real long after. If this video made you think, share it with 3 people who care about soccer, or with 3 people who think they don't. Follow the channel so you don't miss what's coming next, and leave a comment below. Something sincere. Tell me how you feel about watching the World Cup this year, knowing everything you now know. And tell me what story you want us to cover next. We're listening.